Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very happy today to be in company of two of the great experts on the subject matter we're discussing today, which is Saudi Wahhabism. I know that Zoom conferences and events are actually marathon to make the best of the attention span of all of us. So I'm going to do a brief introduction of the book and then present our speakers and kick off the discussion. So today we're discussing this book, Wahhabism and the World, Understanding Saudi Arabia's Global Influence on Islam. And I really like this book and wanted to have this book talk for three reasons. One of them is that this is a very well documented book on a subject that a lot of people think they have heard about over and over again, especially since September 11th attacks in 2001. But this book really teaches us a lot of new things that we'll discuss today. And yet it is very easy to read. It's accessible to people who are not experts in Islamic affairs, who are not experts on Saudi Arabia, but would like to really understand from experts what's the big deal about the Saudi religious influence across the globe. The second reason why I think this book is really worth this discussion is that every single chapter in there is based on field work. This is really a collective work that could only have been done collectively. And I really salute the editor, Peter Mandaville, for leading this group of authors who didn't just write about, universal or international influence of Saudi Arabia without looking closely and in depth into different countries or just by doing desktop research. We have here authors who interviewed and lived in the countries and could touch the day-to-day influence of Saudi religion and Saudi da'wah, or call, as we say in English. And despite this, I also think it was very reasonable and very honorable from the authors to say that this is a subject that's where it's very hard to reach, absolute conclusions. It's not an easy task. The third reason why I urge you to read this book, and I wanted to have this discussion, is that it really contests and questions many of what we thought was conventional wisdom about the expert of Saudi religion and Saudi religious activity across the border. It questions the origin, it questions even the essence of what is Wahhabism, not only inside Saudi Arabia, but across the globe. Is Wahhabism in Egypt or in Indonesia or in Britain the same as elsewhere in the world, in sub-Saharan Africa or even Latin America? And for these three reasons, I thought that, this is a book that we should discuss today. And with me to discuss it are two dear colleagues and friends. So the editor of this book, Peter Mandaville, who is a professor of international affairs in the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He has done so many things that I encourage you to read in his bio. And my dear friend from Paris, Stéphane Lacroix, who is an associate professor at the Paris School of International Affairs of Sciences Po Paris and a researcher at the Center for International Studies and Research. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. So I'll kick off with Peter. Peter, as I said, so many things have been written and said about Saudi influence on Islam globally, right? So since 2001 up until now, and not only this, but the US government itself has downgraded the importance of this subject when it comes to threats to the defense and the national security of the United States. And yet here you are writing this book. Why do you think this subject is still relevant today?
Great. Thanks so much, Yasmine. It's great to be with you and Stéphane, and thanks so much to you and to the Carnegie Endowment for hosting us today. So you're absolutely right that one common reaction we've received the book is the idea that, well, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia seems to be pulling away from some of this international da'wah activity. So maybe the book is a little bit too late, that, you know, this is no longer relevant. But I think that there are a number of reasons why we still need to be studying and trying to understand the very complicated question of Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism. One is simply the fact that there's continues to be a lot of misunderstanding about the phenomenon in general. We tend to, particularly in the Washington environment in which I live and work, we tend to throw around the word Wahhabism in a very loose and easy way, as if we all understand exactly what that is and what that means. And one thing that we try to do in the book is to show that there is no given identifiable object called Wahhabism. It's not a monolithic phenomenon. Really, theologically speaking, what we're talking about is Saudi, or the Saudi variant of Salafism. And while it is absolutely possible to identify some defining characteristics of Saudi Salafism, the question of its export becomes very complicated because the number of Saudi institutions, actors, and individuals that pursue this work with widely varying agendas and religious orientations means that it's never one thing. The extent to which the religious influences that emanate from Saudi Arabia become adapted and contextualized locally when they reach their destination countries means that it's not one single thing. And the range of third-party mediators that get involved in this work along the way mean that it's not one monolithic thing. Just to give one brief example on that latter point, there was a period of time at the height of this work in the 1970s and through 90s, when some of the organizations such as the Muslim World League and the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, the institutions that are heavily identified with the transmission of Saudi religious influence, were actually, their management ranks were staffed primarily by figures associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. So what you have is Saudi money funding religious activity that's being transmitted through conduits that are controlled and shaped by Muslim Brotherhood agendas. So it's a very complicated phenomenon. It's also important for us to understand it from a historical point of view. You mentioned the date of 9/11 as sort of the beginning of the conversation. I think that's certainly when we started talking about possible direct connections between Saudi Wahhabism and international terrorism, the ways in which, for example, Saudi religious influence shapes the Salafi jihadi milieu and is connected to the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But there's been a much longer discourse about Wahhabism and the ways in which it has shaped and reshaped Muslim contexts that, you know, predate 9/11, but have never really been fully understood or properly studied. And so there's an important, you know, historical record to create here. And finally, even though Saudi Arabia does seem to be pulling back, and we document this in the book, in the terms of the magnitude and scale of its religious export activity. Some of the impact that it's had, you know, from the 1970s and 80s has been so profound in certain settings that you still see that impact. So there are important legacy effects that need to be understood. And finally, I'll just mention very briefly, and I assume we'll get into this later, even if Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman seems to be reorganizing and placing new constraints on the religious sector in Saudi Arabia, I believe that at the end of the day, he's a pragmatist, and that if there are ways in which Saudi export of religion can at some point help to advance aspects of his agenda, I think it's a tool that he won't hesitate to use. So for all these reasons, I think this book continues to have relevance today.
Of course, and I think as we go into the discussion, our viewers and listeners will notice why this book is different, and we will, of course, get into that last point. Stéphane, do you have something to add about the subject of this book? Because you're someone who also, for a very long time, although your chapter in this book is on Egypt, for a very long time you have studied Saudi Arabia itself.
Thank you very much, Yasmine, and thanks to Carnegie for the invitation. Thanks to Peter for directing this great project. I think this book is something that I was hoping to see for at least 15 years, so I'm glad that someone did it, and it was Peter. So thank you, Peter. No, I think it's really important to correct a number of misconceptions, and many of those misconceptions have been laid out by Peter. I think another problem has been this comparison with the Comintern and communism. The idea that Salafism or Wahhabism was to Saudi Arabia what communism was to the Soviet Union, and that there was some kind of Comintern, and that you could then read everything that Saudi Arabia did abroad with Salafism as the exercise of some type of soft power coming from Saudi Arabia, right? So this idea that Salafism was Saudi Arabia's soft power tool. And I think this is not completely untrue. Sometimes it's partly true, but it's much more complicated than that. And the only way to understand it is to look inside Saudi Arabia, how things happened. As Peter said, Saudi Islam was very diverse. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been at least as much on the receiving end of religious influences in the 20th century as it's been on the exporting end. That's one, and Peter said that very well. But also, religious actors in Saudi Arabia throughout the 20th century have had quite a large margin of autonomy, right? And again, that goes against the vision of Saudi Arabia as autocratic, pyramidal, verticalized system where all decisions are taken within the royal family. And that was not the case. This is becoming the case that was not the case. So historically, the religious sphere in Saudi Arabia did have quite a margin of autonomy, which means that many of the things that religious actors did in Saudi Arabia cannot be explained by political interest. I mean, when many of these guys gave money to this or that, or and independently, they didn't do this because someone from the royal family told them to do so because they had a political objective in doing so. Sometimes it was the case. Sometimes it was the case, but not always. I mean, in countries, especially after the 80s, where there was an Iranian presence, for instance, then the Saudi leadership would get involved because it would see it as a political necessity to support Salafism in order to counter Iranian influence. That was the case in Pakistan, for instance. So there you can see clear political connection, but it was not always the case, again. So to understand what Saudi Arabia did, you have to look at that complexity. You have to understand that, I mean, there was a bit of ingenuity. I mean, I think the Saudis were really being naive for quite a while. I mean, the 60s and 70s, the Saudis, or at least the Saudi leadership, didn't see the contradictions in all of these different brands of Islam. They saw Islam as one. And they thought that by projecting this image of protector of Islam across the world, that would benefit them politically. But they didn't look into the details of what versions of Islam were exported. Of course, all of this was under the broad umbrella of Salafism, Wahhabism, whatever you want to call it. But again, under that broad umbrella, you could put many, many different things. So I think, it's really important to start with Saudi Arabia and to start by understanding what Saudi Arabia is as a country, what relationship it has to religion internally, because without that, you cannot understand what happens outside the country.
I think, I was going to move to another question, but actually I'd like to draw from Stéphane's points to go back to you, Peter. But before doing that, I would like to remind our audiences that if you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. In order for us to have time for them by the end. So Peter, I mean, the book, and as Stéphane said right now, actually kind of deconstructs the different actors and institutions, elements and vehicles that, at the end are called, Wahhabism, and made this market of Saudi ideas that circulated globally. But one challenge of saying this is who can deal with it? If you want to solve the problem that in this market of just Saudi ideas, there has been radicalization and there has been mutations of the ideology that was exported. Sometimes, by local actors, and sometimes by Saudi scholars themselves issuing fatwas, like in the case of Indonesia, for example, allowing for the use of violence against certain communities. Does this mean that it is futile or I wouldn't say useless, but it is limited to ask the Saudi government to act on combating those ideas? Because you're kind of saying in the book that the Saudis created a monster that they no longer have full control of. then in that case, is the Saudi government still capable of doing something about this monster or not?
Yeah, so in line with the point that Stéphane was just making, I think that many Saudi officials would be genuinely confused if they were asked to, quote unquote, do something about this problem, simply because they don't understand it or see its effects in the same way that many observers who are downstream from this funding and its impact in the world do. And so, I think there was a time when it was possible to have, and to some extent, the United States government did have certain kinds of conversations with the Saudis, particularly with respect to higher and greater regulation of private Islamic charities after 9/11, where there seemed to be very clear conduits of finance that linked Saudi money to particular groups and movements. That was a relevant conversation to be had. But it's complicated from a policy point of view because there was a period of time, Yasmine, when the United States actually quite openly welcomed Saudi's export of religious influence. Stéphane made this point that Saudi Arabia is sometimes regarded as like the global control and command hub for like an Islamic Comintern. And I actually think that in Washington, D.C., at the height of the Cold War, it was perceived that way. And in the course of researching the book, I had the opportunity to speak to a number of American security and intelligence officials who told me quite openly that in the 1970s and 80s, Washington, D.C. absolutely welcomed and encouraged this kind of activity on the part of the Saudis because Washington viewed it as a useful counterbalance to communist influences in Muslim majority countries that were seen at risk of, experiencing some kind of pro-Soviet insurrection. And so I think there's a complicated policy equation here because, when I remember when Mohammed bin Salman was asked about this, a few years back in an interview, he said, "Oh yeah, we did it because the Americans asked us to." Now, you can't reduce it to just an American request, but he's actually correct to some degree that Washington, D.C. did welcome this. So from a policy point of view, I don't think that asking the Saudis to stop it is the right way to address some of the more problematic dimensions of it. I think it has more to do with analyzing and understanding that the impact of Saudi religious transnationalism has varied enormously from setting to setting and from context to context. The impact that it has, the nature of the quote unquote problems that it creates varies, and they need to be addressed and dealt with in their specificity, in all of those different kinds of contexts.
Before delving into those contexts by talking about the chapter that Stéphane wrote about Egypt, I would add to the complexity that you, in your book, you dedicate an entire chapter, for example, to the labor who went to Saudi Arabia and then went back to their homes. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people from across the globe that carried those ideas. And to think that by simply telling Saudi Arabia, stop doing it, you can control those people or the ideas that they circulate in their own countries, and how those ideas get received is something that, of course, very quickly reaches its limits. The same thing for pilgrims. And this is something you also mentioned, that it's not just about institutions, it's about individuals who come to Saudi Arabia, stay, carry those ideas, and go back home with them. Among those individuals, of course, are Egyptians. Right, and Stéphane, what I really liked in your chapter is that really it encapsulates all those misconceptions that we had about the export of Saudi Wahhabism and show in the Egyptian case how they are wrong. Like saying that, Saudi Wahhabism is the father or the parent of Salafism, that Salafism was invented in Saudi Arabia and every Salafi across the world has a special connection or imported Salafism, his Salafi ideas from Saudi Arabia. You show very practically how this is not true in the case of Egypt, but you also show how the interaction between Egyptian Salafism or Egyptian Salafis and Saudi Salafism had an impact and shaped the context of Salafism and of Salafis in Egypt, including after 2013 until this day. So I'd like you to explain this very complex relationship and tell us what does it say about Saudi Wahhabism and about, its expert in the Egyptian case.
Thank you, Yasmine. Well, what I've been trying to debunk in the Egyptian case is the idea that Salafism in Egypt is all about oil money and the 1970s, right? And I think in order to do this, we need to go back in history. Because in the end, the Salafi movement in Egypt goes back to the 1920s, long before Saudi Arabia had oil. And in the 1920s, it started with what I would call religious entrepreneurs who were part of the movement of Islamic reformism and who were attracted to Saudi Arabia for reasons that had little to do with money. I mean, money was part of it, but in the 1920s, you couldn't expect Saudi Arabia to give them huge amounts of money. So one has to remember, I think, in all of this, that in that period of the first half of the 20th century, when most of the Arab world is being colonized, is under colonization, or in the case of Egypt, formerly independent, but still under the helm of the British. Saudi Arabia is one of the very few independent countries in the region. It is one that owes nothing to colonialism. It is one that has an endogenous political system that was formed in the 18th century based on Islamic traditions, right? And many of these Islamic reformists of the early 20th century are actually fascinated by Saudi Arabia. Of course, adding to this, it's the land of the two holy mosques. So in that sense, when you see, of course, Rashid Rida is the most famous of them, but Muhammad Hamad al-Fi'i and many of these men of the 1920s acting as propagators of Saudi Arabia's religious model in Egypt. They're not doing it because of money. Yes, they do establish a relationship to King Abdulaziz. Yes, they do end up receiving some form of aid, but it's nothing comparable to the 1970s. And yet, it's crucial because the point I'm making in the book is that that movement of Salafization of the religious discourse in Egypt actually starts in the 1920s. By the time Nasser comes to power, it is actually pretty much there in the religious sphere. And that explains retrospectively why in the 1970s in Egypt, the religious revival that Egypt experiences with the Gamat Islamiyya and many of these groups is actually rooted in Salafism. And this is before the oil boom. Of course, the oil boom ends up playing a role. It accelerates the movement. It feeds into it. But again, looking at an explanation that Saudi influence is all about money in the 1970s is not true. I mean, again, the movement in Egypt has much deeper roots, right? What I also try to show in the book is that you do have various groups in Egypt that pertain to Salafism. The oldest one of them, the one that was established in the 1920s, Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, has a direct relationship to the Saudi religious establishment. But many of the movements that were established in the 70s do not, right? And in particular, the one that would become the major movement of Egyptian Salafism in the 2000s, which is a Da'wah Salafiyya, the Salafi call, the one that establishes Hizb an-Nur after 2011. Well, this is a movement that actually has no relationship to Saudi Arabia whatsoever. The Saudis do not like them. Ansar al-Sunnah treat them as competitors. There's no good relation in Egypt, and they don't have much of a relationship either to the Saudi government. Of course, they do get money because everyone is getting money, right? And again, this is where in the 80s and 90s, there is so much Saudi money flowing into religious networks across the world that they get a bit of it. But they don't get a bit of it because of a special relationship. They get a bit of it because everyone's getting a bit of it. The Ikhwan are getting a bit of it. Everyone's getting a bit of it at this point. That means that, and this is what I try to do in my chapter, right? Reading post-2011 Salafis in Egypt as being some type of Saudi proxy and explaining the political behavior of Salafis in Egypt, and especially Hizb an-Nur, right, the party founded by these guys, as simply responding to political orders by Saudi Arabia. Of course, they didn't like Morsi. Yes, they didn't like Morsi, but they had plenty of good reasons as part of the Egyptian, religious competition between Salafis and brothers, not to like the brothers. They didn't need the Saudis to tell them not to like the brothers. So what I'm trying to do in that chapter is to propose a different reading and to account for what the Salafis did, opposing the brothers, supporting Sisi in 2013. I'm trying to account for that by showing that there's perfectly good Egyptian reasons why they would do that, with no need to explain this through a foreign actor as Saudi Arabia. Of course, they later tried to develop relationships actually after 2013. Now, Yasser Burhami and Da'wah Salafiyya has been going to Saudi Arabia much more. But it's actually, that development is a consequence of 2013, not the reason for 2013. So that's a bit of what I'm trying to show in the chapter.
So that's, that brings us to, other case studies in that book, where there are some common elements still by which we can say what factor plays a role in the localization or the impact of the Saudi experts. One may say that in Egypt, as Stéphane said, there was already a Salafi thinking. There is already, an intellectual tradition of intellect and of writing and of publishing that existed that might have played a role in, opening a space or not to the Wahhabi ideas or to Saudi Salafism, this very specific brand of Saudi Salafism. In other cases that you show in the book, the other elements played a role in either making, the ground more fertile for Wahhabi ideas or blocking them. And you actually show in some cases that inside the same country, sometimes you had competing factions within the Salafism that was imported from Saudi Arabia. So I would like you, Peter, to talk to us about, the common factors from all those case studies that played a role in this localization of Wahhabism, or making it feeling welcomed and having an impact or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Yasmine, the case of Indonesia is a very useful one to compare and contrast with the Egyptian context that Stéphane just spoke about. And the point that you just made about different groups and individuals in the receiving countries competing with each other, again, just helps to reinforce this idea that Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism is not monolithic. And in fact, in some cases, what we see downstream, again, I keep using this word downstream, like in the countries where the money and the support for religious causes happens, sometimes what we're actually seeing is the manifestation of domestic political competition between different Saudi entities playing out in a third country. The Indonesian case, I think, is really interesting and a good one to contrast with Egypt, because not only did Egypt already have an established Salafi sector, if we can call it that, by the time that its interaction with Saudi Arabia started, Egypt, of course, had for centuries by that point been a major center of Islamic learning. Just in the broader culture of Islamic history. In a case of Indonesia, that country, I think has often experienced periods of time where it has perceived itself as needing to look to and rely on what is sometimes viewed as more authentic Islamic learning located in the Middle East, right? This idea that, the Middle East is really this sort of theological ground zero and heartland of Islam. And so you had plenty of flow of, for example, Indonesian students from the 19th century, late 19th century onward, going to study at places like Al-Azhar in Egypt. And certainly once the International Islamic University of Medina was established, suddenly there was a lot of money available to fund generous scholarships to bring young Indonesians to Saudi Arabia to study Islam. And so I think that sometimes this sense that there's a need to rely on or grant greater authenticity to religious interpretations and religious rulings coming out of Saudi Arabia has meant that the equation is slightly different in Indonesia. But I think, as the author of our Indonesian chapter, Professor Nur Haidi Hassan, shows very clearly, it's not simply an easy equation of like a sort of Saudi Wahhabi wrecking ball that comes smashing through this beautiful, pristine, traditionalist Sufi orientation that dominates in Indonesia. It varies considerably based on, you know, different provinces and geographies of Indonesia. And it often, as you, Yasmine, have been saying, a lot of it has to do with individuals and individual stories. You know, in Indonesia, you have certain very prominent religious figures, like the former head of the PKS party, which is basically the Indonesian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hidayat Nur Wahid, who was himself a student at the International Islamic University of Medina and maintains strong connections with the Saudis. And so a lot of it is about these individual stories rather than about sort of the overwhelming influence of institutions.
True, but it is also true that even if you don't have this monolithic Saudi, you know, Wahhabi wrecking ball that comes, it has had very, or it's still having very deep consequences. I mean, the chapter on Indonesia and elsewhere, you see how sometimes those Salafi areas make their way to the education system. And so when on a national scale in an education system, you have, you know, those ideas, it becomes, you know, generations and generations of citizens that embrace those ideas, right? Which makes solving the problem inside Saudi Arabia, or again, if it is perceived as a problem, not necessarily reflecting in those countries, right? So, I mean, I'll stay with you, Peter, just and I'll get to you, Stéphane, on how far do you think the changes inside Saudi Arabia can go in changing the legacy of those years where Wahhabism was consciously exported from Saudi Arabia to those countries?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right that in some cases, in some countries, we've seen a profound impact on the education system, particularly the system of religious education in these countries. But in also, you know, when it gets to the question of conflict and violence, we tend to be having a discussion, usually in policy settings, about whether, for example, mosques funded by the Saudis, you know, serve as recruiting centers for, you know, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and groups like that. I actually think that there's a more important set of questions to be asked about the ways in which Saudi Arabia's export of religion has had a catalyzing impact on latent intercommunal tensions in a number of countries. That is not so much about extremism or violence, but just the ways in which countries where there was already an existing social conflict, particularly where it tended to fall out across lines of intra-Islamic demography, you know, where Sunni and Shia were involved, you know, you naturally have this impact whereby the arrival of Saudi religious influence just exacerbates this divide and accelerates it to open conflict, in some cases to violence. So when it comes to the question of what changes might be happening in Saudi Arabia today and how they can have some impact, well, you know, we hear a lot today out of organs such as the Muslim World League, right? This is one of these Saudi-funded parastatal organizations that for decades has been one of the chief institutional entities involved in exporting Saudi religious influence. The current Secretary General of that organization, Sheikh Mohammed Al Isa, handpicked by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, you know, has really been talking a lot about the need for tolerance and pluralism and coexistence. And, you know, you suddenly see the Muslim World League issuing press statements about the dangers of anti-Semitism. Sheikh Al-Isa took a, you know, very well publicized visit to Auschwitz, you know, to talk about the horrors of the Holocaust, you know, which for people who have been following the Muslim World League for decades, this is like, makes your head spin around because, you know, some decades back, you would have actually identified an organization like the Muslim World League as an entity that is connected with spreading opinions and ideas that would sort of charge and give credence to anti-Semitic views. So at the level of talking points and publicity, I mean, yes, I would rather that we hear the Muslim World League saying things like it's currently saying, but I think, my question is, are we also now seeing regional and country offices of the Muslim World League committing resources to developing programs that are focused on bringing to schools in those countries education about the problems of hate speech and anti-Semitism? I'm not sure that that's going on, because a lot of what seems to be happening is really at the level of public relations rather than actually getting into the kind of work that would have an impact on solving the problems.
Indeed, I share with you the concern that, we should not just see Saudi Arabia stopping to export those ideas and ideology, but we should see the kingdom actually committing the same amount of resources it committed to exporting those ideas to countering them today. Stéphane, I'll go back to you with some challenging question, because we're talking about what's happening inside Saudi Arabia. So it's not just that the discourse addressed to the outside is changing, but there has been changes inside the religious sector in Saudi Arabia. Of course, I'm going to ask you, of your assessment of those changes. Do you expect them to be more than PR, and if they are more than PR, are they done in the way to generate the results that are hoped for in terms of reforming, the Saudi religious space? And is the Saudi religious sector becoming more comparable to its peers in the Arab world? It has always been, this rare model, the Saudi model, when it comes to comparing it to the rest of the Arab world. Is it becoming the same? Is it becoming a state religion that is controlled by the state and no longer having the autonomy that you talked about before?
Yes, absolutely. That's the project. The project is to again, verticalize the religious establishment, to exert direct control over religious actors in the same way that this is done in Egypt, for instance, or in other countries in the region. So to finally create a state Islam that is under the direct control of the princes, and so that has no longer any autonomy. That's been the project of MBS. You can actually trace that back to the 1990s. I think the beginning of this is the 1990s, because the 1990s is the moment of clash. That is, it's the moment when that autonomy and diversity of the Saudi religious sphere clashes with the regime, because that diversity and that autonomy produced a politicization of parts of the Saudi religious sector. It is what is known in Saudi Arabia as the Sahwa, Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the Islamic Awakening, all these groups that popped up in university campuses in the 70s in Saudi Arabia, was a much more political understanding of what Salafism entailed. And those groups would gradually become hostile to the Saudi regime until in the 1990s, in the wake of the Gulf War, the clash finally happened. The movement was crushed in the mid-90s. And from that point, you can trace back all these initiatives that go back to the late 90s that were aimed at putting the religious sector under control. Except that under first King Fahd and then King Abdullah, all of this took place at a very slow Saudi pace, but you can still trace attempts to exert greater control. With MBS, the process is accelerating enormously, right? One group that has been particularly targeted is the Sahwa, that is those politicized Saudi clerics. And those were very powerful back in the 80s and even still in the 90s. Many of them were released from jail in the late 90s and regained the public presence in Saudi Arabia. So MBS's first decision was to destroy the Sahwa as a movement, to accuse them of terrorism and to put them in jail. Now MBS is playing a double game, right? On the one hand, he is using a PR strategy of appointing people like Muhammad al-Isa, whom Peter mentioned, who kind of fit perfectly the message that MBS wants to send to the world. Moderate Islam really looks very much like what the UAE has been doing for a while, So you have a number of these figures. Adil al-Kalbani is another one of them, although at this point he's probably lost some credibility since he's appearing in video games. But that's been one thing that has been people have been making fun of in Saudi Arabia, because for the recent Riyadh season, he appeared in an advertisement for a video game. But you have these kind of modern, quote unquote figures that MBS wants to show to the world, especially. Inside the country, you still have a strong presence of loyalist Salafis, right? Salafis who hate the Sahwa, who don't like politicization, who remain very Salafi in their religious, social conceptions, but who also strongly believe that supporting the regime is a religious duty. And they're kind of torn, because at this point, the regime is probably doing things that, as conservative Salafis, they don't like, but they still believe that supporting the regime is the only thing to do. So these people are still very much within the establishment in Saudi Arabia. And I think they actually are playing a role in stabilizing the country for MBS, right? So you kind of have two classes, right? An emerging class of enlightened, quote unquote, ulama, who are especially important to show to the world. And then a class within the system that is especially influential within Saudi Arabia, that remains very conservative, but that is ready to abide by MBS's project, because again, they believe that ta'at walil amr, supporting the ruler is a religious duty. This might reach a breaking point, by the way. I don't know how far MBS can push this guy, because he's pushing them really far, right? So that's one of the questions. But MBS in the end is doing with what he has. I mean, he cannot, and I think maybe he is somehow sincere in that, at least. I think MBS really wants to make Saudi Arabia a kind of XXL version of the UAE. I think he would be really happy to have a whole new class of ulama who would say exactly what Sheikh Ibn Bayya or all of these moderate Sufis in the UAE are saying. And he would be happy with that kind of class. But again, he has to do with what he has. And what he has is a very decentralized Salafi movement, one that is full of tensions, one probably over which he doesn't have as much control as he thinks, especially outside the kingdom. So again, he's doing with what he has. That's my assessment.
Sure. I think, we have many questions and comments, but I think a lot of them have to do, in order to group them, with, the complexity of the idea that Saudi Arabia is not exporting one thing, and that being an Egyptian Salafi, an Indonesian Salafi, or even a British Salafi in your case, or even a Salafi from the Sahel, is not the same. Saudis, you can proclaim yourself a Salafi, but it doesn't mean that you are exactly the same Salafi in the other country, right? Also, on the relationship with other communities and the role that those communities used in changing or reshaping the entrance of Wahhabi ideas into a country is shown, for example, by Sufism in the Sahel. Right. And I know, Peter, you love to talk about Sufism, because you always say that there is this idea that Sufism is great and peaceful and lovey-dovey. And it's actually Sufism, in a sense, has shown teeth against Wahhabism when it came to the Sahel, and actually made it softer. Right? Can you just in a couple of minutes talk about this case study? Because I found it very interesting, because you get the idea that these communities don't have solid institutions and so cannot stand up to Wahhabism, but actually they did.
Yeah, I think
briefly though.
Sure, no, again, this speaks again to one of, I think, the great mythologies of the post 9/11 Western security discourse, is this idea, as people in Washington, D.C. tried to make sense of this thing called the Muslim world, that they suddenly had to understand that, okay, there are the ones called the Salafis, and those are bad because those cause violence. And then there are these other ones called Sufis, and these are like, warm, cuddly, fuzzy people. And they're not against, they're against violence, they're peaceful, and so what you need to do is to fund them and support them. And if you scale up the influence of the Sufis, then they will somehow combat and negate the influence of the Salafis. And just, aside from the preposterousness of that basic idea, it I think betrays a deep ignorance of the sort of ecosystem of Islamic thought and authority and how it works in different contexts. And again, the context of the Sahel in Africa is another one in which Saudi religious influences, when they reached that area, didn't encounter a tabula rasa where Muslims were sitting there waiting to be told how to be good and authentic Muslims. You had a very rich and deeply ingrained culture that was absolutely infused by Sufism, but it was a Sufism, as many forms of Sufism are, that are actually quite conservative in orientation, that are interested in and have a deep culture of Islamic law. That means that there's this encounter and dialogue that takes place. And in order for Saudi religious influence to have an impact, it has to enter into some level of negotiation and compromise. And this is not an effect that's limited just to the Sahel. You see this in numerous settings around the world where Saudi religious influences enter, where there's this necessary adaptation that takes place. And again, it's not just a one-way journey. Local religious authorities in places like Mali and Mauritania also sent their own influences back to Saudi Arabia as well. In great, cities of Islamic learning in Saudi Arabia, like Mecca and Medina, you have West African scholars that are actually regarded as authority figures, and who have themselves exerted some influence on not just religious practice in Saudi Arabia itself within certain networks and settings, but have also had an influence on the way in which Saudi Arabia seeks to reach out to and have an effect in other settings and contexts.
Stéphane, I would like to, talk more about that last point that Peter made, also to tackle some of the questions received. One of the great merits of this book is that it proves that what is called, quote unquote, Wahhabism has actually never been 100% Saudi, exactly because of what Peter has said, in the sense that there were flows of ideas and people who contributed to the Saudi theological, but also, religious thought in general, and who played a role inside Saudi Arabia in producing what has become known today Wahhabi ideology, inside or out. But at the same time, we are facing, the dilemma, or let's say the official narrative, that anything bad about Wahhabism was not Saudi. That precisely because we had this foreign influence, that Wahhabism became bad. But Wahhabism originally was peaceful and nice, and we're going to go back to it. There is this idea, in the Saudi narrative today that, okay, yes, we had foreign influences that made Wahhabism more violent, made it more aggressive, made it, less friendly to other communities. So we're getting rid of this. How true is this? I mean, on the one hand, yes, we do recognize that there have been foreign influence on Saudi Wahhabism, but should we, by embracing this, then embrace this narrative that said it is this foreign influence that made Wahhabism bad?
Oh, it's a rewriting of history, obviously. I mean, it's a political rewriting of history. And it is something that is very common across the Middle East these days. I mean, with the rise of local nationalisms across the Middle East, from Morocco to Egypt to Saudi Arabia, everyone is claiming that extremism came from abroad. We were good and moderate until, so the Egyptians are saying we were good and moderate until the Salafi influence came. The Saudis say we were good and moderate until the Egyptian influence came. The Moroccans say we were good and moderate until the Egyptian and Saudi influence came. So everyone has, an explanation of why, the foreign influence was always the culprit. So the Saudi version of it is what you said, right? And MBS has been, making that official, right? He's said this in speeches that, before 1979, everything was fine. We had a good moderate Islam, and then the foreign influences came in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and the Muslim Brotherhood, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it's much more complicated than that, right? I mean, Saudi Islam was always very conservative to begin with, right? And I mean, in the 18th century, if you go back to the early days of the Saudi state in the 18th century, I mean, it is a revolutionary movement, right? I mean, when you read the writings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and his conception of jihad to expand the first Saudi state, I mean, it's not, I mean, it's pretty harsh, when it comes to the way he deals with people who do not believe in the correct creed, right? What happened in Saudi, though, is that early revolutionary religious movement was later put under the control of a state, right? It was nurtured politically, right? So what happened in the 20th century is that the clerics would no longer have anything to say about politics, and they would be put under the political control of the princes. But in exchange for that, they would have autonomy in the religious sphere, right? Where they would be able to spread their conservative ideas. So, I mean, when you see, again, the statement made by MBS, and then you read the Majmu'at al-Fatawa, the compilation of fatwas of the Mufti of Saudi Arabia in the 50s and 60s, Sheikh Mohammed bin Ibrahim, you can see that he's pretty harsh, and you have fatwas prohibiting wearing trousers, and you have, of course, when it comes to ikhtilat, to mixing men and women, it's absolutely forbidden, right? You did have in those years, though, liberal spaces in Saudi Arabia that existed as well, especially around Aramco, around certain milieus of technocrats. And now, pro-MBS Saudis are looking at the existence of those liberal spaces in the 50s and 60s and 70s to say, look, those existed in Saudi. Of course, those existed, but it was not the country. The country was still run by conservative social and religious norms. So again, Wahhabism, as I said, contains that revolutionary potential that was unleashed in the 18th century by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. Again, if you go back to his writings, you see that very much. And that is why some of the jihadi groups have been doing, in a sense. I mean, going back to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and say, look, he's saying it, we're just doing the same thing, which is true in the 18th century. In the 19th, especially in the 20th century, it's no longer true, right? The politics have taken over, right? Wahhabism has been transformed into a non-revolutionary conservative religious tradition, right? Very conservative religious tradition, right? So again, the idea that Saudi Arabia was liberal back in the 50s and 60s is not true. Does it mean that, these Wahhabis, quote unquote, of the 50s and 60s were necessarily jihadi? They were not either jihadi. They were just conservatives who defended a conservative brand of Islam, and that was the dominant brand in Saudi Arabia. So, in a sense, MBS is kind of mixing all these questions together and finding an easy culprits to rewrite history. And I think, again, was it Nietzsche that says that, in order to, nations need to start by forgetting so that they can actually exist as nations, I mean, in a sense, the forgetting is part of the process of nation building, right? In a sense, what he's doing is that he's trying to build a nation today, a Saudi nation. He's, calling for, in a sense, forgetting what happened before 79 in order to write history in a way that makes it compatible with what he expects from the Saudi nation today. So yeah, I think it's what we're seeing at this point.
But I mean, and this is a question to both of you. I mean, the three of us are very critical of the what is called casually religious reforms, and it's debatable whether these are real reforms or not. But should we give them more credit in changing not only the religious space inside Saudi Arabia to what we perceive as being better, meaning more tolerant? And should we give them some credit in having some impact, even if on the long term, on again the Wahhabi legacy abroad? Should we give them more credit than we're giving them right now? It's to both of you.
Just to be clear, I think there is something happening at the social level in Saudi Arabia, which is transforming Saudi society very much. I think this goes with political intolerance. So what we're seeing at this point is more political intolerance than there ever was, and more religious tolerance and social, liberalization than there ever was. So it's which makes it very difficult to assess what's going on in Saudi Arabia at this point. People who think that religious tolerance and social liberalization is what matters, and they are ready to disregard the degree of repression that is going on in Saudi, those are going to be happy and say what's going on in Saudi Arabia is great. Those who believe that a political speech is important and that this used to exist before 2015 in Saudi Arabia and no longer exists, and that's a major issue, those are going to say no, what's going on in Saudi Arabia is actually very problematic. So again, it's very difficult to give an assessment because what we're seeing is two very contradictory trends. I wouldn't say, again, it depends where you're looking from, right? So, but it is real in the sense that it's not just cosmetic. This is where I disagree with some people who think that what's going on in Saudi Arabia is only speech. It's actually having a genuine impact on the ways Saudis live. They live probably in more political fear than they ever lived, but now they can go to concerts, they can hang out between genders, they can do a lot of things they couldn't do. So again, it's a trade-off in a sense.
Yeah,
Peter, while answering, can I just ask you to tell us also what would be the impact on outside Saudi Arabia?
Sure. So, I mean, in answering, I essentially agree with what Stéphane said. Anyone who has spent time in Saudi Arabia recently can't help but observe that something is definitely changing. But I think we need to be careful to not equate this with an embrace by Mohammed bin Salman or the Saudi royal family of liberal values. I think this is an instrumental openness, carefully patrolled, carefully regulated, that is mainly in service of a particular economic vision, right? And so it's not reform out of a support normatively of reformist values. And I think it's the primary goal of the Saudi public relations machinery right now to kind of convince people outside Saudi Arabia that when, Mohammed bin Salman talks about returning to moderate Islam, he means moderation in the sense of pluralism and coexistence and tolerance. No, he means moderation in the sense of politically quietist Islam, Islam that doesn't ask difficult political questions and respects the authority of the Al Saud. So yes, there is absolutely something changing. And so I think, Stéphane's point that we need to see how far this can go. To what extent can you absolutely turn upside down and stretch the boundaries of a very specific compact and bargain that was created over the years without causing certain backlashes and pressures to build is fascinating. In terms of externally, again, I'm not someone who wants to say, oh, the story of Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism is over. We do see evidence that in absolute terms, the amount of funding, the amount of Saudi external support for religious activity has been reducing consistently over the last 20 years. That said, I still think that there are ways in which the Saudis, and particularly even Mohammed bin Salman himself, find some utility in it. And this is particularly with respect to Iran, right? Even as the religious police have been pulled off the streets of Saudi Arabia, even as there have been certain constraints placed on the ability of Saudi preachers and ulama to travel outside the country, there is also signs that some of them that are traveling to places where there are significant Shia populations and Shia minority populations are actually being encouraged to be more vocal in their anti-Shiism, which in the eyes of the Saudis, anti-Shia means anti-Iran. And so I think we continue to see ways in which the Saudi export of religion has a geopolitical edge to it. And I think that so long as the incumbent political power in the kingdom sees some utility in that particular instrument, it will continue to be used going forward.
Well, we are 2 minutes away from the end of this discussion. I'd like to thank both of you very much, not only for writing the book. As Stéphane said, we have been waiting for this book for a long time to tell us what is Wahhabism, what is Salafism, and why there is no such thing as monolithic Wahhabism or Salafism, but also for doing it seriously with a good methodology, recognizing the limits of what we can know and learn. So thank you very much. We have 2 minutes left. If you have any final comments, please go ahead.
Peter, you're the editor.
You're the leader.
You're the leader.
You're the reason we're here
Gang.
today.
You're the reason for all of this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just say briefly, if I may, the book has a very sort of personal side for me as well, because, you know, I'm someone who was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, actually. The third generation of my family to live and work in the kingdom as American expatriates. And so for years, I would hear these stories about Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism, and the ways in which it was politicized, where, you know, countries that were the geopolitical rivals of Saudi Arabia would talk about how this is basically funding for terrorism. Countries more aligned with Saudi Arabia would say, well, you know, it's conservative religion, but, you know, there's no real issue here. And my sense was always that the truth was somewhere in between. And I really got interested in trying to do this when, through my own research, I kept visiting so many Muslim settings where people would do some version of a story where they'd say, well, we used to do Islam this way, and then the Saudi money began to arrive and things began to change. And so it's that change that I wanted to understand. And I'm so happy, and thanks to the Carnegie Corporation for providing the support that was needed to do this book and to allow us to recruit superb people like Stéphane Lacroix to be part of it. Thank you.
I definitely agree. It's superb. Thank you, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks so much. Take care.